If you ever held a Dreamcast pad in your hands on a rainy Saturday afternoon in 1999, beware of a GD-ROM spinning up, the little VMU face blinking at you like a secret companion, then you already understand why Sega's final console has aged like a fine whiskey instead of going flat like so many of its contemporaries. The Dreamcast was the last hurrah of an industry still ruled by bold ideas, an era when a console could be a quirky experimental lab without shame. And that's precisely why the Dreamcast feels as good today as it ever did. Its library didn't chase trends, it created them. Which means it isn't chained to the time period it came from. Booting up a Dreamcast in 2025 isn't an exercise in retro curiosity. It's a reminder of what video games look like when they are allowed to breathe. No 300 gig installs, no screen updates, no microtransaction traps. Just plug in, hit start and fall headfirst into something bold, colourful and wildly confident. The Dreamcast was designed for joy, not just profit extraction, and joy doesn't age. That's why playing it today still feels like coming home. So with all of that said, join me as we celebrate this classic console. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is why you all need a Dreamcast right now. Yeah! The Sega Dreamcast was magical and you could feel it in the launch catalogue. Soul Calibur wasn't good for its time. It was a visual slap to the face that made PlayStation 1 owners wonder whether they'd been living in monochrome. Jet Set Radio reinvented how style could be weaponized. Shenmue wasn't a game so much a dare. Try to tell us games can't be cinema. These were declarations from developers who still believed magic was the point, which is why we should appreciate them. Speaking of games that should have your appreciation, as sloppy as a lot of the modern gaming scene is, there are still many awesome gems to enjoy, and what's even better is that using my links, you can get them for next to nothing. Click below to save 50% on the excellent Expedition 33, 40% off of the beautiful Stellar Blade, 29% off Black Myth Wukong, and up to 90% off of many of the greatest retro indie and modern titles available online. But since it's Black Friday weekend, over on Instant Gaming, every single hour someone gets their entire basket refunded. You just buy what you were going to buy anyway, and if the system picks you, your whole order goes to zero. There are 96 chances across the weekend, one every hour, and they post the winners in their Discord, so it's not one of those mysterious corporate winner situations, they literally list them. So if you're thinking I'll wait until payday, don't. Use my special Black Friday link which takes you straight to their event page. It counts for the refunds and you can check back each day as new games unlock, and then join their Discord to see the winners list. It's only this weekend and it genuinely is even better than their usual discounts, which is saying something. So happy gaming, happy savings, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this Dreamcast deep dive. Experiencing the Sega Dreamcast in its own time is one of those gaming memories that never really fades away. It was not a system defined solely by specifications or by a single killer app. It was a moment. The Dreamcast felt like the future at a time when the word future still had substance in gaming. Today we are surrounded by incremental updates, refreshed models and vague promises of generational leaps that rarely amount to more than a performance bump. But when Sega's little white box entered the world, the leap from the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 to Dreamcast was so stark that it felt as if the industry had jumped through a portal. It was the last time many of us genuinely believed that we had just stepped into a new era of gaming, not merely an updated one. My first encounter with it did not happen at an expo or a fancy display booth. It happened in the most ordinary way imaginable, in my next door neighbour's house. He was 15 at the time and in true British fashion was working illegally in a corner shop for £2.50 an hour. Those meagre wages were somehow enough for him to purchase the Dreamcast at launch, which meant that I, by sheer proximity, was granted access to the future. I still remember sitting in his living room as he powered on Sonic Adventure for the first time. Sonic appeared on the screen not as a jagged bundle of polygons, but as something close to a living character. The colours were vivid, the animations were fluid, and the environments felt like real places rather than abstract spaces. That opening escape from a city, running down a sunlit coastline as if the world itself was accelerating around you, was so unlike anything we had seen on consoles that it felt unreal. Yet the Dreamcast was not content merely to dazzle with graphics. For the first time in my life, I saw a game console that allowed you to go online. My neighbour and I were clueless teenagers with no intention of responsibly navigating forums or early web culture. we discovered chat rooms, and instead of philosophical discussions or international cultural exchanges, we used the Dreamcast to wind people up in real time. Essentially, we had discovered internet trolling before even realising it had a term for it. That was our first taste of online communication in video games, and it arrived not through a PC, but through Sega's final home console. Speaking of experiencing the bizarre world of the information superhighway, as they called it back then, the strangest moment came when he signed up for a copy of Choo Choo Rocket, Sega's online puzzle oddity. After entering the details, a few days later, a physical copy arrived at his house. It felt like magic. A console had requested a game from a void, and that game had appeared through the letterbox as if conjured. Looking back, it was primitive, even quaint, but at the time it was unthinkable. The idea that a video game machine could reach into the world and send something to your home felt like pure witchcraft. On that day, I didn't simply realise that I wanted a Dreamcast, I saw a glimpse of the direction the medium could go in if a company truly believed in innovation rather than caution. To understand how Sega arrived at a console of such audacity, we need to step back and examine what the company had become by the mid-1990s. Sega had been a titan of the arcade scene and a genuine contender in the living room thanks to the Mega Drive. Their hardware had swagger, their mascot rivaled Mario, and they were confident enough to poke Nintendo in broad daylight. But their momentum evaporated in dramatic fashion. The Sega CD, the 32X and the Saturn were poorly timed, poorly communicated and poorly received, especially in Western markets. Each one chipped away at consumer trust, each one made third-party developers more skeptical, and each one eroded Sega's once unshakable image of technical brilliance. By the time the Saturn limped into its grave in the late 90s, Sega were not simply wounded, they were fractured. Sega of America, Sega of Europe and Sega of Japan were essentially acting as competing factions rather than coordinated branches of a single entity. Internal rivalries and misaligned priorities created an atmosphere where major decisions were made in isolation. What followed was one of the most bizarre episodes in hardware history. Two separate next-generation consoles secretly developed within the same company, each branch effectively racing against the other. Sega of America under Shoichiro Irimajiri, and with the involvement of IBM's Tatsuya Yamamoto, partnered with 3DFX to design a system built around the Voodoo chipset and a Motorola PowerPC processor. This project, codenamed Black Belt, was bold and rooted in the booming PC graphics landscape of the time. Meanwhile, in Japan, Hideki Sato, who had helped architect the Mega Drive, led the development of a competing design. Their machine, first known as the White Belt and later as Dural, used a Hitachi SH4 CPU and an NEC Power VR2 GPU. Both projects advanced far enough to be viable products. Neither side was informed that the other would ultimately be chosen. The political connections between Sega of Japan and NEC ultimately tipped the scale towards Dural. The American team, who had invested months into their own solution, saw their work scrapped. Staff left, relations soured, and in the most Sega twist imaginable, 3DFX sued them. The dispute was settled out of court, costing the company money at a time when they could scarcely afford to lose any. It was a ridiculous situation, and yet from that chaos emerged something crucial, a design philosophy that represented the complete opposite of the Saturn's overly complex hardware. Sega had finally listened to the complaints. The Dreamcast would be developer-friendly, cost-efficient, and built with proven components rather than experimental circuitry. Once Sega Japan's design was chosen, the machine shed its dual codename and took on a new identity, Katana. Even the name betrayed Sega's intentions. After years of indecision and tangled engineering, this was their attempt to forge a clean blade, sharp, elegant, and capable of striking directly at the PlayStation's heart. The company were acutely aware that they could not survive another Saturn-level mistake. They needed to rebuild trust with developers and consumers alike, and that began with transparency. Rather than shrouding the new system in secrecy or surprise launch theatrics, Sega started revealing its full specifications as early as May 1998. They held the Sega New Challenge Conference, where the Katana's architecture was shown openly, not as a mysterious black box, but as a practical tool. At the time, this decision felt almost unheard of. Console makers tended to treat their hardware as proprietary secrets, but Sega made an uncharacteristically sensible call. If they wanted third-party developers to return, they had to give them something understandable. That began with the Hitachi SH4 processor, running at 200 MHz. While the frequency figure sounds quaint today, the SH4 could perform roughly 1.4 billion floating point operations per second. That mattered because 3D games live and die by floating point maths. It allowed the system to handle lighting, physics, and geometry in ways previous consoles simply could not. If the Saturn was a cluster of mismatched machinery held together by prayers and duct tape, the Dreamcast was a clean, well-designed engine.
Missed. Thanks, kid.
The graphics hardware was no less ambitious. Sega paired the SH4 with the NEC Power VR2, a GPU capable of crisp, colourful visuals that rivaled Sega's own arcade boards. The Dreamcast could output more than 16 million colours, run many titles at 60 frames per second, and even display progressive 480p via VGA, which was practically unheard of for a console in 1998. This wasn't marketing spin. When people say that Dreamcast ports were arcade perfect, it isn't hyperbole, it is a literal description. The connection to arcades wasn't incidental, it was deliberate. Sega's Naomi system, introduced the same year, was built on the same CPU-GPU pairing, with the key difference being the arcade board's use of ROM modules rather than optical discs. That similarity created an almost magical synergy. Sega could develop a game for the arcade, sell it to operators, then port it to the Dreamcast with minimal compromise. The two machines were, as Eurogamer later put it, two sides of the same coin, one for commercial amusement centres and one for your living room. People often talk about the Dreamcast's technical power as if it were a simple matter of faster chips, but its greatest accomplishments were philosophical. It marked a rare moment when Sega understood that the most advanced hardware in the world means nothing if developers do not want to use it. The Dreamcast wasn't designed to punish programmers. It wasn't built like a puzzle box. Developers could work within Sega's own proprietary SDK or opt for Microsoft's Windows CE environment, allowing PC veterans to bring their projects to the console without reinventing their workflow. It was, in the words of Seaman creator Yut Saito, the first console he could treat like a PC. The Dreamcast, in its essence, was a machine built for experiments, and that philosophy would define its short life more profoundly than any marketing slogan. Sega's newfound clarity didn't stop at the internals. The console's form factor reflected a similar practicality. The Dreamcast was a compact, cleanly designed unit with 4 controller ports built directly into the front, a sharp contrast to the growing trend of 2-port systems requiring expansions. It was a statement of intent. Sega wanted multiplayer in the living room. They wanted laughter, arguments, and competition to be part of its everyday use. It was in many ways the spiritual successor to the Nintendo 64's social focus, but with the technical elegance Sega had always wanted to achieve. And then there were the VMUs, the Visual Memory Unit, a device that remains one of the strangest, most charming and misguided experiments in console history. Functionally, it was a memory card, but pushing the Dreamcast controller's transparent front hatch revealed a miniature handheld device with its own buttons and LCD screen. It could store save data, display contextual information while you played, and even run small standalone minigames. The idea was absurd, brilliant, and deeply Sega, a company incapable of restraining its imagination. You could raise a Chow from Sonic Adventure on the bus, monitor health bars in Resident Evil, or just watch quirky pixel animations blink and wiggle as you played. In the long term, the VMU was more novelty than necessity, but at the same time it helped cement a feeling that the Dreamcast was not simply another machine, it was a toy box. It was fun. Despite the Dreamcast's strong engineering and clear technical identity, its early fortunes varied dramatically depending on where you lived. Japan was first to receive a system, launching on the 27th of November 1998, priced at 29,000 yen. Sega wanted a clean break from the Saturn's complicated legacy, but they stumbled almost immediately. The Japanese launch catalogue consisted of precisely 4 games: Virtua Fighter 3TB, Pen Pen Triathlon, July, and Godzilla Generations. Of these, Virtua Fighter was the only meaningful draw. The rest felt like curios rather than headliners, and the lack of variety sent a clear message that Sega had rushed to launch in that country. Chip shortages compounded the problem. Sega simply could not manufacture enough units, and sales that could have been captured evaporated into thin air. This was not a symbolic misstep, it was a logistical one, and it left the Dreamcast limping out of the gate in a country where brand loyalty mattered and first impressions lingered. Sega had hoped that an early Japanese launch would buy them time before Sony unveiled its PlayStation successor. Instead, it created the impression that the Dreamcast was fragile, a powerful system with too few games and too little support at home. Fortunately, things were very different in the United States. It landed on a date burned in the memories of everyone who lived through it: 9999. 19 titles accompanied the system on day one, including Sonic Adventure, Soul Calibur, House of the Dead 2, Tokyo Extreme Racer, and Power Stone. It was a library that did not apologise. It was loud, confident, and unafraid to be strange. One generation earlier, Sega had accidentally fractured their audience. Here, they were unified in their intent to reclaim it. The reception was explosive. 500,000 units sold in less than 2 weeks. The Dreamcast went from underdog to national phenomenon in the space of 14 days, and for a fleeting moment, Sega America, so often the tragic figure in the company's history, finally looked like they might have engineered a comeback. If Japan had given the Dreamcast a tentative nudge, America lifted it onto a podium and began lighting fireworks. The marketing campaign embodied Sega's confidence. Its thinking didn't explain the console so much as frame it as something unpredictable and unnerving. It didn't invite players in, it challenged them. Most gaming advertisements in the late 1990s still fixated on raw splash images and exaggerated slogans. Sega's approach was almost psychological. The Dreamcast was not a machine, it was a mind, and you were daring it to impress you. Strangely enough, it worked. Had history stopped there, Sega would be remembered as the company that resurrected itself with the boldest console of its generation. But history does not freeze when a company needs it to, and unfortunately for Sega, their success in America arrived at precisely the wrong moment. In March 1999, Sony unveiled the PlayStation 2, and from the instant it was announced, the Dreamcast no longer stood alone on the mountaintop. Sega built the right console at the wrong time. Sony's message was not subtle. The PS2 would be more powerful. It would boast unprecedented graphical capabilities. It would play DVDs, something the Dreamcast could not do, and it would be fully backwards compatible with the original PlayStation's library. For millions of consumers and retailers, that last point mattered more than any technical claim. The Dreamcast needed to earn support. The PS2 already had it. Sega were asking people to trust them again. Sony were offering people a path they did not require faith in at all. But the most catastrophic blow came not from Sony's marketing department, but from Electronic Arts. EA refused to support the Dreamcast. There would be no Madden, no FIFA, no heavyweight annual franchises that had become the backbone of console ecosystems. Without those titles, Sega's shelves could never compete in the mainstream. Hardcore fans might buy Soul Calibur or Jet Set Radio, but parents buying a system at Christmas would look for the familiar and, finding none, would in many cases wait. The momentum that had buoyed Sega in the United States began to crack. Price cuts, rebates, and aggressive promotions delayed the inevitable, but once the PS2 launched, the Dreamcast's fate was sealed. Its greatest strength, that feeling of stepping into a generation leap, evaporated the moment Sony turned the conversation into one of practicality. Sega was selling possibility, Sony was selling a DVD player that ran games. If the Dreamcast's launch proved that Sega still knew how to build a console, that its library proved they still knew how to build a legacy. For many players, myself included, the Dreamcast era is not defined by one masterpiece, but by a cascade of them. Games so confident in their identity that they felt as though Sega were racing against the clock to express every last creative impulse before the light went out. The first title most of us encountered was Sonic Adventure, and with it came the strange sensation of seeing a character we had grown up with finally arriving in 3 dimensions with a sense of scale and spectacle that his previous outings could never deliver. The game is not flawless, nor is it the undisputed high point of Sonic's long history, but its impact on Dreamcast owners was unmistakable. Sonic Adventure felt like a celebration. Its bustling cityscapes, its sweeping beaches and highways, and its unstoppable momentum communicated a single message: the hardware mattered. This was a world you could move through rather than simply navigate. It was, in retrospect, Sega making a statement about where the Blue Hedgehog belonged, not as a relic of the 16-bit scene, but as the opening act of the next era. Playing it today exposes its rough edges. The camera can be temperamental, but non-Sonic stages often feel like distractions, and the plot wanders in peculiar directions. There was a very specific electricity to it, a sense that your childhood mascot had graduated to adulthood and brought you along for the ride.
Megumi, you need to be careful around cars too.
Yes.
As significant as Sonic was, it was Shenmue that redefined what the Dreamcast could achieve. It is a game whose reputation has become almost mythological, not because it was universally adored, but because it proved that video games could evoke atmosphere rather than simply deliver tasks. Shenmue has the pacing of a quiet film, the framing of a memory, and the ambition of a project that does not care whether the market is ready for it. I still remember receiving it at Christmas and watching my grandfather, who had never followed gaming in any serious way, stare at the screen in disbelief. "This is a video game?" he asked, as if the machine had tricked him. There was no Pac-Man, no garish score counters, no blinking arcade prompts. There were shops and umbrellas, strangers walking to work, the slush of winter on the pavement, and a protagonist who had to glance at his watch because time existed. Yu Suzuki's free system, for reactive eyes entertainment, was a fancy label for something deceptively simple. You could move through space as a person. The town had its own rhythm. NPCs clocked in and out of jobs. Arcades existed inside the game, where you could play Space Harrier, a relic of gaming's past embedded inside its future. For many players, Shenmue was the moment we learned that a game could be contemplative. It did not need to shout to be profound, it only needed to breathe. The sequel, Shenmue 2, expanded this idea into something grand and dreamlike. The walled city of Kowloon is one of the most unforgettable locations I've ever explored in a game. Knowing that it once existed, demolished in the late 1980s, lent to its eerie gravity. Shenmue 2 conveyed the scale of Hong Kong with a confidence that most modern open worlds still fail to capture. It felt less like a sequel and more like a continuation of a journey that had been interrupted only temporarily. Looking back, there's almost a tragic irony to the fact that we had to wait nearly 2 decades for Shenmue 3, only to discover that the spell could not be recast. But for a moment in history, my opinion at least, the Shenmue series was the apex of gaming. When Shenmue asked players to slow down, Soul Calibur asked them to wake up. It is difficult to overstate how astonishing that game looked on day one. Fighting games had always been showpieces. Of course, the spectacle of Street Fighter or Tekken rested on sharp animation and character flair, but Soul Calibur felt different. It was smooth in a way that felt impossible for home consoles at the time. The camera glided across arenas, blades clashed with elegant clarity, and every fighter moved with a confidence that told you the Dreamcast was not merely replicating the arcade, it was surpassing it. For many of us, it became the benchmark title to show people who didn't get the Dreamcast. You didn't explain anything, you simply handed them a controller. Capcom's Power Stone realised another part of Sega's vision, the social one. The 4 controller ports on the front of the console was not decoration. They were a promise, and few games fulfilled it as joyously. Power Stone 2 was not a technical demo or a cinematic odyssey, it was chaos. Walls collapsing, items raining from the sky, weapons being thrown across 3D arenas while everyone shouted at each other from opposite ends of a sofa. It had that rare quality that the Nintendo 64 had captured a generation earlier. Easy to learn, hilarious to play, impossible to put down. In an era when multiplayer still largely meant sitting in the same room with friends rather than matchmaking with strangers, Power Stone 2 became a ritual. Groups would gather, controllers would be claimed, and every session would descend into spectacular lunacy. Crazy Taxi distilled Sega's arcade heritage into a command. It did not pretend to be sophisticated, it did not introduce you to carefully sculpted story arcs or introspective journeys. It threw you into traffic with a screaming clock and told you to go. The sun-soaked city pulsed with colour, pedestrians dodged your bumper as you drifted around corners, and an off-spring soundtrack rattled the speakers. In its simplicity lay its artistry. To play Crazy Taxi was to play a Sega arcade machine without leaving your living room. It was proof that the old magic still worked when placed in the right context. Then came Jet Set Radio, a game so stylish and self-assured that it felt like it had been smuggled out of another medium entirely. Its cel-shaded art style defied the realism obsession that had begun to dominate late 90s development. It was not aiming to look like the real world, it was trying to look alive. Graffiti tags bloomed across walls, rival gangs chased you, police blared sirens, and every corner of the city felt like a panel in a comic book reacting to your movement. The soundtrack was eclectic, energetic, and unforgettable. Jet Set Radio did not just stand apart from its contemporaries, it rejected their entire philosophy. You were not meant to study it, you were meant to feel it.
Take this!
We also received this game, Skies of Arcadia, offering something that the Dreamcast desperately needed: hope. It was the kind of JRPG that reminded players of why adventure mattered in the first place. Instead of grim dystopias or moral ambiguities, you were given skies filled with floating islands, colourful characters, and a protagonist who genuinely believed in the good of the world. Its airship battles, its sense of discovery, and its refusal to wallow in pessimism made it a tonic at a time when everything else in the industry seemed determined to appear mature. Skies of Arcadia was earnest, uplifting, and sincere without apology. In its own quiet way, it became the emotional centre of the Dreamcast library. Taken together, these games illustrate something that numbers and launch charts can never capture. The Dreamcast was not simply powerful, it was imaginative. Sega poured the last of their creative excess into it, and every major title feels as though it was trying to prove a point, that video games could still surprise you if someone cared enough to take the risk. For all of its brilliance, the Dreamcast's success was never uniform. Japan had been reluctant from the beginning, and the arrival of the PlayStation 2 essentially ended the contest there before it began. Sega redirected their efforts towards Europe and North America, hoping that momentum abroad might counterbalance the losses at home. Europe in particular looked promising. The Dreamcast entered the region on the 14th of October 1999, bolstered by a marketing budget so large that it felt almost reactionary, a last-ditch attempt to seize attention. Robbie Williams fronted the campaign. The iconic swirl logo was recolored blue to differentiate it from the Japanese version, and Sega promised the potential of 6 billion players online, a claim that now reads like an earnest dream rather than a piece of marketing bravado. Sales were healthy at first. In the United Kingdom alone, 500,000 consoles moved by Christmas, but distribution was uneven. Retail partners received stock at inconsistent times. Some regions waited weeks longer than others, and the technical details that had made the Dreamcast such an attractive proposition gradually turned into headaches. European units shifted with 33.6K modems instead of the 56K modems bundled with the American versions. It sounds trivial in a modem context, but at the time it was the difference between feeling like a pioneer and feeling like someone's being sold last year's kit. Worse still, Sega's attempt to counter piracy with the GD-ROM format backfired spectacularly. The discs were designed to hold approximately a gigabyte of data, slightly more than standard CDs, and it was assumed that the unconventional format would deter copying. Within months, hobbyists had broken the security and discovered methods to burn Dreamcast software onto ordinary CDR media. One of the most powerful consoles on the market became one of the easiest to pirate, and every unauthorized copy represented a missed sale at a time when Sega needed every one of them. By the dawn of 2001, Sega no longer had the luxury of pretending the tide could be turned. The Dreamcast burned bright. The PS2's gravitational pull was too strong. Developers drifted back to Sony. Retailers grew hesitant to restock a platform whose manufacturer was visibly struggling, and the arcade market, for decades Sega's backbone, began its own decline. The mathematics no longer worked. Sega made one final push. They experimented with aggressive pricing, online incentives, and high-profile advertising. Peter Moore, who had taken over Sega America after Bernie Stolar's dismissal, fought hard to salvage the console's fortunes. But the gap was too wide. Moore later stated that Sega needed to sell more than 5 million units by the end of 2000 to even have a chance of sustaining the system. They fell short by roughly 2 million. It was not a matter of passion or creativity, it was a matter of survival. On the 31st of January 2001, Sega announced formally that it would exit the hardware market. 2 months later, on the 31st of March, the Dreamcast was discontinued. The last stand of a once towering company had lasted barely 18 months. The story should end there, but with a clean corporate obituary and a bitter sense of waste. And yet, in characteristic Sega fashion, it did not. The Dreamcast demise is often framed as a business failure, and in simple numerical terms, it was. But reducing its end purely to market forces or quarterly losses overlooks one of the most extraordinary acts of corporate sacrifice gaming has ever seen. When Sega announced its withdrawal from the hardware business, the company was not merely bruised, it was facing an existential collapse. Manufacturing costs, dwindling sales, fractured leadership, and years of legacy debt were converging into a threat that could have erased Sega completely. And then, one man intervened. Isao Okara, Sega's chairman, did something almost unimaginable by modern corporate standards. He personally forgave more than $700 million in debt that the company owed him. He did not restructure it, he did not convert it into shares. He simply wiped it away, absorbing the loss himself so that Sega could survive. He used his own personal fortune to pay employees, satisfy obligations, and give the company enough stability to transition from being a hardware manufacturer into a software publisher. He ensured that the world would not lose Sega forever, even if it meant sacrificing the Dreamcast. Okara died only weeks later on the 16th of March 2001. The timing makes the gesture feel almost mythic, as if the man's final act was to shield the company that had given him purpose. Colleagues, competitors, and even critics acknowledged the deed. It was not the kind of financial manoeuvre a chief executive makes to secure a legacy. It was the kind a parent makes for a child they refuse to abandon. In an industry where executives are often remembered for layoffs, hostile takeovers, or opportunistic mergers, Okara's name remains synonymous with loyalty and sacrifice. His intervention allowed Sega to live on. The company would never again produce a home console, but it would continue to exist as a publisher, carrying its characters and intellectual properties into a new era. Without Okara's decision, there would be no Yakuza series, no Sonic Resurgence, no Atlas acquisition, and no chance for Sega to recover its footing in the decades that followed. For all the tragedy that surrounds the Dreamcast end, the company's survival is arguably the greatest legacy of its short life. The Dreamcast funeral might have been written by accountants, but its afterlife was scripted by the community. Something remarkable happened in the years following its discontinuation. People refused to let it fade. Fans, collectors, engineers, and independent developers treated the Dreamcast not as a relic, but as fertile ground. Hardware too full of creativity to be discarded simply because the market had moved on. In Japan and Europe, boutique releases began to appear. Independent studios such as NG Dev Team developed titles like Last Hope and Gunlord, games that looked and played like descendants of the arcade lineage the Dreamcast had been born to champion. Likewise, projects like Intrepid Lizzie embraced modern indie sensibilities while still feeling unmistakably at home on the hardware. These releases turned the Dreamcast into something rarely seen in mainstream gaming, a platform simultaneously historical and current, a museum piece that still demanded participation. At the same time, enthusiasts turned to preservation and enhancement. The GD-ROM drive, once positioned as a piracy deterrent, had become an obstacle. The community responded with aftermarket solutions like GD-EMU, USB GD-ROM, and Mode, which replaced the optical drive with solid-state storage. These modifications not only preserved aging units, removing mechanical failure from the equation, but also reduced load times, effectively elevating the original hardware to a state it could never have reached in 1999. For people who grew up with the Dreamcast, these devices became a means not of cheating nostalgia, but of extending it. Even the console's pioneering online features, dismissed as quirky experiments in the dial-up era, were resurrected through ingenuity. The DreamPie project allowed modern broadband connections to emulate the original service infrastructure, bringing online functionality back to games such as Phantasy Star Online, Choo Choo Rocket, and NBA 2K1. Players were suddenly able to meet, chat, and battle on hardware that had outlived 2 console generations. What mainstream companies abandoned, hobbyists restored. The Dreamcast online vision, derided in its own time as premature, became a badge of honour. And for those who preferred to play digitally rather than on original hardware, emulation matured in parallel. Red Dream and Flycast, once experimental projects, evolved into emulators capable of rendering games with astonishing accuracy, widescreen output, higher resolution, and improvements that exceeded even the original machine's capabilities. In a poetic twist, the Dreamcast became easier to experience in 2025 than it was in 2001. The world had finally caught up to Sega's ambitions. Communities formed around these tools: forums, fan wikis, translation hubs, and hardware repair groups. The most dedicated congregated at places like Dreamcast Talk, where tutorials, patches, and handwritten guides transformed what might otherwise have been a museum exhibit into a living ecosystem. While PlayStation 2 shipments filled garages and attics, the Dreamcast existed in bedrooms, offices, and basements like a cult heirloom played by believers, not simply owners. To this day, the Dreamcast embodies an ethos that the industry has largely abandoned: the belief that hardware should inspire creativity rather than enforce conformity. It may have been discontinued prematurely, but its brief life was generous. It gave players new ways to communicate, new ways to experiment, and new ways to imagine what a console could be. No one remembers the Dreamcast because it sold well. They remember it because it dared to be different. Looking back now, it is tempting to describe the Dreamcast as a miracle that arrived too late. Sega had already exhausted its goodwill through previous missteps, and by the time they finally produced a console that deserved to succeed, the market had been conditioned to look elsewhere. but to stop there would be to misunderstand what made the Dreamcast special. It was not merely a strong system that happened to fail, it was an expression of everything Sega had ever been at their best: daring, innovative, playful, and utterly unwilling to accept the boundaries that sensible companies impose on themselves. The Dreamcast represented the moment when game consoles still embraced identity. They built a machine that asked, what if games were strange again? What if they surprised you? What if the point was not simply to win, but to feel something? Such questions produced a library of titles that still resonate today, not only because they were good, but because they were courageous. To play Jet Set Radio, Skies of Arcadia, Soul Calibur, Shenmue, or Crazy Taxi is to encounter developers who were not afraid of failure, because they understood that mediocrity, not risk, is the real enemy of art. Most consoles earn fans, the Dreamcast earned loyalty. It is remembered not because it dominated a generation, but because it refused to behave like the others. In a world where so much of gaming is shaped by algorithms, projections, and lowest risk design, the Dreamcast remains a testament to the idea that imagination still matters. You cannot quantify why Shenmue mattered to the people it touched, or why Jet Set Radio's graffiti felt like a manifesto. You cannot justify Skies of Arcadia's idealism in marketing terms, but you can feel them even decades later. So if you still believe that gaming can be bold, plug in the Dreamcast tonight. Listen to the familiar chime, watch that spiral logo materialise, and remember what it felt like to hold the future in your hands, even if that future only lasted 18 months. You really do need to get yourself a Dreamcast right now. Also, don't forget you can click below to save 50% off on the excellent Expedition 33, 40% off the beautiful Stellar Blade, 29% off Black Myth Wukong, and up to 90% off of many of the greatest retro, indie, and modern titles available online today. Maybe you want to play the classic Shenmues, for example. Also, since it's Black Friday weekend, every single hour, someone gets their entire basket refunded. So if you're thinking, I'll wait until payday, this time, don't. Happy shopping, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheerio!